And afterwards, for a number of years, he would talk about his work as semantics, as a kind of shorthand. And then later on, he realized that that was too imprecise because people were confusing it with the study of words, the meanings of words, and so forth. And unfortunately, Korzybski did talk a lot about language and how people use language and how language uses us, so to speak. So people got that what he was doing confused with this linguistic semantics, and it created problems even in his lifetime because people, when you approach something with a viewpoint that that viewpoint may be at quite a divergence from what it actually involves, and if you're not careful, you can just end up ignoring a lot of important things that you might learn if you had a more open point of view. And basically the term general semantics, which I like to get away from, just has over the years I've just observed that it confuses a lot of people. But, all that aside, now that I've given that forenote, basically to answer your question, what is general semantics? I talk about it as, well, let me continue from where I left off the previous story with the time binding. Korzybski was 1921. He'd written his first book, Manhood of Humanity. It had been printed by E.P. Dutton, the big New York publisher. That was an interesting story about how that got published by Dutton, but I'll leave that for another footnote some other time. But anyhow, after that, Korzybski was interested in the mechanism. How does it work? And he began to realize that he was trained as an engineer at the Warsaw Polytechnic. He was a graduate of the first, 1901 or 1902 class, I can't remember. Warsaw Polytechnic in mechanical and chemical engineering. And then he had traveled around Europe and fought in the war eventually. He was kind of floundering around, but he came to the United States, and after the first book, 1921, Manhood of Humanity, he's looking for the mechanism. The reason I went into his background a little bit more with the engineering, and his father was an engineer interested in science too, so he got that from a young age. He began to see that mathematics, which he loved, and science, as in what you could call scientific method, had the key to opening up time binding to other areas that we traditionally have not thought of as scientific. So what he attempted to do then was to study the sciences of his time when he was writing the book, which he presents this stuff, Science and Sanity, that was published in 1933. He was taking the sciences of that time, of that decade, and that early period of the 20th century, and trying to extract from it a methodology, a way of looking at how human beings process information and think, and to develop a methodology that could be taught to children, which he did. And that was the book, Science and Sanity. The first draft of that was written, actually, I'm in Pasadena, California, and the first draft of it was written in Pasadena in 1928. He had been struggling with it for years, and finally he just spit it. He came to Pasadena thinking he could get help from friends at Caltech, which he didn't really get that much help. And he wrote that book then. But I think I lost track now. I don't know if I was...
Okay, so Korzybski is about 1/100th as famous as many of those he influenced, such as Albert Ellis and John Grinder and Buckminster Fuller and Alvin Toffler and Robert Heinlein, who's mentioned in a Robert Heinlein short story blow-ups happen.
Yeah, yeah.
Even influenced L. Ron Hubbard, I guess, Alan Watts.
Yeah.
He was very influential on it over a certain type of the intelligentsia.
And it's actually I mean, when you mention those different names, I would say that each one of those individuals I could talk about a little bit in terms of what the influence or the mutual influence might have been, because they vary in their degree, and they vary in degrees.
Why don't you take Albert Ellis, and we'll go from there.
Well, Albert Ellis was basically another way of talking about what Korzybski was doing. I will get back to Ellis because it does connect. It does connect to the question about influences, which is sort of the main thing. What Korzybski was doing, I said, was attempting, after Manhood of Humanity, and what he produced was this system that he called, unfortunately, general semantics, which I call a kind of applied epistemology, or applied theory of knowledge and decision-making, at any rate. So what he was trying to do, and what he did to the however level of effectiveness it had, was develop a methodology where he was extracting what was the useful kind of thinking that scientists and mathematicians did when they worked successfully. And then, so he wasn't, he had a long list. One of the funny things about Korzybski was, some of his critics had said that he didn't acknowledge influences. And on the first page of his magnum opus, Science and Sanity, I say Science and Sanity because it could sound like Science in Sanity. In the first page or two of that, he has a list of people whose works influenced him, including Aristotle. So, and then people like Martin Gardner, who I just briefly mentioned in the book, but who was ever present in my thoughts. He had the gall to say that Korzybski was basically one of the things that made Korzybski unsound, was that he didn't acknowledge any influences. Apparently Gardner never read Korzybski's books. I don't know where he got that from. So Korzybski certainly acknowledged influences, and in a way what you could say he was doing, he was noticing the trend in which human knowledge, not just science and mathematics, but that sort of exemplified it, the trend in which it was going, and was trying to pick out the basic underlying changed worldview, the changing of premises that he viewed as being there in the development of the science of his times. So in a way, what he was attempting to do with his work was to see if he could accelerate the trend that was already taking place, that he didn't start, and he certainly wasn't the only one who was moving along that path, but he wanted to take a broader view and show the trend of things. So a lot of the people that you mentioned, like for instance Buckminster Fuller, I don't really talk about Fuller in the book. I mean, I just had to leave out a lot of stuff because it would have been a lot longer book than it is. But the two actually met probably in the 1920s or early 30s. I'm not sure when they met exactly. Somebody who interviewed Fuller got the story from him. At any rate, Fuller and Korzybski met, and then later on, after Korzybski died, Fuller was probably in Korzybski's awareness and some of the things that he had been doing and writing in the late 40s. But it wasn't until just after Korzybski died that Buckminster Fuller began to work as a speaker, as a presenter at the Institute of General Semantics seminar workshops. And he did that for a number of years. And it's interesting, none of the references or biographies of Fuller that I've seen have any mention of his connection with Korzybski or with the Institute when it was giving courses in the 50s. They just don't mention it. Now they have on the archives, I think they have Fuller's